Bonjour, tout le monde. Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to be part of this amazing symposium on ambrosia or the ragweed species. My name is Antonio. I go by the name of Tony DiTommaso. I'm currently the chair of the section of soil and crop sciences at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. That's in upstate New York in the United States. And I'm really excited to take part and to provide some insight into the ragweed or ambrosia situation here in the United States. And so I'm going to share with you kind of where we're at in terms of its impact, but also what are we doing to try to control or manage to the best of our ability this important agronomic weed and human health weed as well. The kind of current impact in the United States is pretty significant. And I should add that I think most of you know that the common ragweed and giant ragweed are actually native to the northeastern United States and southern Canada, where I'm actually located right now. So the plant that you're all dealing with in France and that I got to see this past summer in the Toulouse region of France is very much native here. So we have this very different perspective on this species, but it's just as troublesome as you're dealing with. Certainly a couple of important aspects in terms of its impact. On the agronomic side, both common ragweed and giant ragweed, ambrosia artemisifolia and ambrosia trifida, are significant agronomic weeds, particularly in our corn, maize, and soybean systems. Even one plant per meter row in some of our research has decreased yield by, in some cases, 20-30%. And up to 12 plants per meter row. If control isn't very good, we've actually had 95% yield loss, particularly in soybeans. So the impact is significant, but also I want to point out that more than 50 million Americans are impacted by allergies caused by our two ragweed species. And the current estimate that is costing the American economy over $1.5 billion US in lost wages and in medication. That is a significant proportion of people that are impacted, and in this case, severely impacted, not just a sniffle here and there, but significantly impacted. So, that is a problem. In terms of its increasing concern, it is definitely increasing concern, and I'll point out a couple of issues. The first is that, as you all know, the plant, these two species are tremendously adaptable, right? They can adapt. We have them on roadsides here in the northeastern United States. And when I lived and was a professor in Montreal at McGill University, I worked very much with the Department of Transportation in Quebec, looking at managing ragweed along roadways. The plants have adapted to saline conditions, very problematic. We are seeing it in vacant lots. And you might know that in some urban areas in the United States, some neighborhoods, basically some homes have been abandoned and they haven't been taken care of. And this is where ragweed moves in. It loves disturbed sites, open habitats, right? The kind of classic story. So that's been a concern. One surprising piece of information that some of you might be aware of that we've noticed too is an increase in the prevalence or the occurrence of common ragweed, and particularly in urban forests. So we're actually seeing it, within urban environments in these woodlots, wooded areas, because they're highly trafficked, and so this is becoming a problem as well. And people the population is like, we've got to manage these plants. How do we do this? So again, vacant lots. This has made it problematic. So the theme that I wanted to convey to you is land use and the increased prevalence of ragweed we're seeing it in the United States. Okay, so development of I guess rural areas, wherever we have new homes going up, and so for any disturbance. And again, this plant is tremendously adapted to this. The other point that I wanted to make, and this was some early work, but great colleague of mine here at Cornell, showing where was this plant actually before the European settlers came to the United States, and basically this plant was just it certainly wasn't as widespread before we started to till the lands. It probably was hanging around pathways of large mammals, the bison, deer, and would just kind of hang in those areas, or if there was a natural disaster. So obviously, as soon as we started to working the land, this plant, the occurrence of it increased, and of course, probably transported to France and other European countries by contaminated crop seed. That's probably the what we've seen, and from what I saw in the Toulouse region, I was just amazed at how bad the situation is in some of the farms. So I can appreciate the work that all of you are doing, because we're facing the same thing with this native species here. The other thing I wanted to mention is that particularly giant ragweed is tremendously competitive in our corn and soybean in the northeastern and midwestern United States. We are having a lot of trouble, as some of you know. So we got land use. We now have herbicide resistance issues. And just to give you an idea of, we have multiple herbicide modes of action. Populations of particularly common ragweed, they've developed resistance to photosystem 2 inhibitors, ALS inhibitors, PPO inhibitors, and glyphosate. Basically EPS, PS synthase inhibitors. And in many cases, we now have populations that have multiple resistance, i.e. many of these in the same population. So it's no longer even easy to say, I'm going to move to another herbicide. And there are areas in the Midwestern United States, particularly in soybean production, that there are no other options, no herbicide options to actually controlling these ragweed species. That's going to become problematic. And giant ragweed, although it populations haven't developed resistance to as many modes of action, herbicide modes of action, we have seen ALS inhibition and glyphosate inhibition. So, and populations that show multiple resistance to these two modes of action. Obviously, if we continue doing what we're doing here in the United States, and there's a lot of concern by both industry, but also growers and academics and scientists, weed scientists, that this cannot continue, we really do need to be thinking about integrated weed control. And I'll talk a little bit about that and kind of what are some things that we're doing. But I wanted to kind of emphasize that what you're witnessing in France and what you're experiencing is very much alive here in the northeastern United States, Midwest. And I can say, because I have some very good Canadian colleagues, that this is happening in Quebec and in Ontario, the two eastern most important agricultural provinces in Canada. So it transcends boundaries, and so this is becoming problematic. So we have land use that's impacting. We've got herbicide resistance. The third pillar that I want to talk about, and all of you are, I'm sure, well aware of this, is climate change, and what climate change is doing to this to these plants, or at least what's happening, how they're adapting. Again, keep in mind, this is a tremendously adaptable species. In fact, it can survive short droughts, as many of you probably have experienced. And one of the features of this species is that under drought conditions, very often seed will be kicked into what's called secondary dormancy. They will basically go dormant, although viable, in the seed bank and not germinate till the following season. So this is a way, the plant is adapting and can handle drought in some cases better than our crops can. But what we've noticed as well, all projections, at least in the northeastern United States, climate projections show that the habitat suitability of the plant based on climate is going to be increasing. And I'm sure there have been studies in France that might show exactly that the species is moving northward. I've seen some of the studies coming out of Europe. I was involved in a study in China showing that definitely there's going to be greater habitat suitability with the projected climate change by mid-century. So that is of concern. Whether the plant is going to show up there or not, is going to establish, is another question, but the habitat would be suitable. And this is particularly a movement northward that has happened. You might be interested to know that a good colleague of mine here in the United States, Louis Ziska, has done some really nice work. He's now at Columbia University, some nice work showing that at least at latitude 44 degrees north, which, you know, we're very close to that here in the in upstate New York or northern New York State, but into Canada, that the ragweed season has increased, I believe, between 13 and 27 days from 1995 to 2009. During this period, the ragweed season, in terms of growth and pollen release, has increased between 13 and 27 days. I mean, that's 3 weeks, 3 additional weeks. That is likely to continue. We are seeing later, earlier emergence, frosts disappearing, and later frosts. So here in the northern United States, the ragweed season ends when we get the first frost. Okay, when we get to about 0 degrees C, the plants generally cannot survive, and that's the end of the season. We used to get those even in the Ithaca area where I am, usually about the 20th of September. It's now pushed back into the 15th of October. So this plant is continuing to produce pollen now, earlier and later, and the season is increased. And that is of a concern. And of course, from an agronomic perspective, it's continuing to compete in our agricultural fields, as maize and soybean typically are still in the field, particularly for growing corn for grain. And the last thing I'll say is that increased CO2 levels have, again, Louis Ziska's work has clearly shown that the plants are producing, have greater reproductive output, okay, and also are producing more pollen. And what's even more, I guess, of concern is the fact that the pollen that is produced is more allergenic. And so, I think there's an interest, and maybe this is some of the work that's going on in France that you're all involved in, is really tying in with medical personnel, asthma allergists, folks that team up to kind of look at this from a human health perspective. So again, lots is happening. I'm pretty sure that you're experiencing exactly the same, situation. So to sum up, yes, there's concern about these species. And again, they're native here, but it's a very problematic species. It continues to be. And so kind of moving to kind of the next area is, okay, what are we doing about it? What are some ways to try to mitigate some of these concerns with these species? And here I'm going to provide some general comments and also just some personal experiences in trying to manage these species. So one of them that I think is at the base is, I referred to before as to integrated weed management or integrated management. We really do need to be thinking about, planting, diversification of our cropping system. We have a serious problem in the United States, particularly in the Midwest, where it's basically maize and soybean that are continually being grown, and many of them are Roundup ready, so transgenic, resistant to Roundup, but also and this, as we all know, this is basic, weed ecology, weed evolution. You're going to have species that are going to adapt to those kind of conditions. So we're fortunate in the Northeast that we also have an important dairy industry. So we rotate our maize, soybean into pasture, alfalfa, and pasture grasses, and that kind of breaks that cycle of ragweed, because we typically will mow for alfalfa 3 times, sometimes 4 times, and that is not happening in the US. So integrated. The other concern is that we're seeing is very often the ragweed is found in field edges, and more of our growers are trying to manage the ragweed in those edges, because that's how the seeds then kind of are moved back into the field when the tillage equipment kind of turns around in these field edges and drags some of the seeds that are produced in the field edges. So managing field edges has become a real important aspect of managing ragweed. But of course, that kind of hits bang on with kind of our interest in trying to increase biodiversity in field edges. And so, that has been a challenge. And I do, I'm very invested in trying to diversify, but perhaps putting in competitive species that are not weedy in that sense would be a way to do it. So another, point that I wanted to make in terms of what we're doing, and this is particularly true for some of our vegetable systems, is we're delaying planting of some of our crops to try to get as much of the common ragweed to have emerged. And in fact, we've been working on some modeling of common ragweed based on soil moisture and temperatures, basically growing degree days, and the hope is hopefully we'll have this available soon, where a grower could be in their field and be able to, hopefully on an app on their smartphone, be able to kind of, based on the day of the year that it is, the type of soil and the conditions, the conditions previous to that particular day, that we'd have a good idea of what percentage of common ragweed might have already emerged, or say if the grower is able to wait another couple of days based on projected temperature and weather, maybe an additional 20% of ragweed can emerge, and then they could either cultivate or put down a herbicide. So kind of trying to use kind of some newer technologies to be able to manage these 2 species is something that's of real interest. And of course, that becomes very site specific, which is really, really helpful, because obviously, as you know, from one region to the other, that can change. So like I said, one of the main ways that we're trying to manage this risk of ragweed and its occurrence and prevalence in our cropping systems is some delayed planting to try to get as much of the early flush managed. And in some cases, we're also early harvesting certain crops. Obviously, not everybody has that flexibility, but wherever you can integrate a crop that can be harvested, we have seen that has worked really nicely for us. Because again, we cut the reproductive cycle of the species. Doesn't go to seed, and in many cases, we harvest it even before pollen is generally released. Just so you have an idea, here in the northeastern United States, where I'm located, pollen season typically starts in August and will peak in mid-September. So this year is a terrible year for pollen. Terrible year. The conditions have been just ideal, very, very high concentrations. And again, the pollen release will continue until we get our first frost, and it looks like it won't happen at least another 2 weeks here, which pushes it into October again. So that's problematic. Other management strategies integrated that we've been working with: cover crops. Not winter, particularly in our winter, suppressing the ragweed as much as possible. Not, I wouldn't say as effective as late planting or early harvest, but part of an integrated system, it's working. It's certainly, in our case, we've got mostly, we'll do winter rye and vetch go in. They're already in this case, at least in our region. And that early suppression before it's tailed under or, killed by herbicide has made a difference in some of our, and we've seen reductions of even 50% of ragweed just by including a cover crop and vegetative crop. One other aspect, and I'm not sure if this is also currently available in France, but we are looking at also weed seed collection. So kind of many of you probably are aware of kind of the Harrington seed destroyer out of Australia. There are now different prototypes that are being used, different sizes that are, go right behind a combine. This is mostly for field crops, and it's done a really good job of controlling a lot of the pigweeds and Amaranthus species, but ragweed as well. And in situations where ragweed is really problematic, having this seed destroyer piece of equipment right at, attached to your combine has been very effective. I'm sure, you could just look me up and at Cornell University, and I'd be happy to collaborate if any of you are interested. In collaborative research, I'm certainly, game and interested in that. But I just want to thank the organizers. I hope you have a productive symposia. This is, very, timely, because this plant has been around and continues to be problematic, not just here in the United States, but obviously now also in Europe, and it's moved into Asia and so forth. So with that, merci beaucoup, and have a great rest of the conference.